I knew it was going to say that. So welcome to the final session of the day. I'm Ian Dennis, as you know, most of you. And this is the first sort of multi-paper standard session of the day and of the conference. So I just thought I would say that I think what we should do is what we usually have done, and even when in person, and that is to have, I'll introduce each speaker consecutively, and we will allow both speakers to give their talks, and then I will save questions for afterwards. But I do have a quick question for Roman at the moment, and that is, I know as we planned, we talked about the possibility of having this space open after the end of the scheduled events, just for overall conversation and so forth. Is that going to be possible after this session ends?
I think so, but let's ask Oron. Oron, can you hear us? Would you mind us to prolong a little this session?
I'm sorry. Come again?
Do you mind that we remain after this session for a while?
No problem. All
right, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That's terrific, because I know a lot of us would love to just catch up a bit too. Okay, so our first speaker is Bishop Pierre Whalon. He is a French American, and he's French and American and bilingual in French and English. Has published a large number of books, articles, and book reviews for both religious and secular publications. Bishop Whalon has done extensive ecumenical work in Europe and in the Middle East, and instigated and participated in interreligious dialogues, especially with Iran. He is president of the Association d'Entraide aux Minorités d'Orient. This is AEMO. It's a France-based refugee organization. Some 5,500 people, those at risk of death for various reasons, for reasons of their faith, have found asylum as a result of the work of AEMO. Bishop Whalon has recently published in Anthropology, but this will be his first presentation at one of our conferences, which is wonderful. It's great. He will be speaking on the divide in the mind, faith and belief.
Thank you. Well, I hope this is indeed my first, and I hope not my last. I'm going to read my text. I can't do like Eric Gans and wing it. Not with this crowd, at least. Good evening, everyone. Like everyone else tonight, I wish we were able to be face to face. But I am truly honored and not a little nervous to be invited to address you at all, an Anglican bishop daring to speak to a conference of anthropologists. Call it my leap of faith. For years, I've been inspired by generative anthropology, first reading René Girard's work during my doctoral studies a long time ago, and then discovering and implementing Eric Gans' signal contributions in my own work. Of course, this interest has nothing to do with me being French. You understand, nothing whatsoever. Dr. Gans inspired me to write an article for the last issue of Anthropology on how theologians and anthropologists can help each other. I want to try to continue those musings tonight by giving some precision to terms in general use, but that have special import to theologians: faith, belief, hypothesis, and knowledge. I am bold enough to offer this in hope that some precise technical definitions of these terms might be of some use to you as you study cultures in general and religion specifically as anthropologists. But before getting into the nitty-gritty, let us recall that science and theology have the same origin: the experience of wonder. Experience in the strict sense of the term is prior to the investigation, introspection, understanding, and definition of that experience. Think, if you will, of your own stirrings that eventually led you to become an anthropologist. In some way or another, something caused you to sense wonder, a feeling of desire, of being open and attracted by something you encountered that invited you to ask questions about being human. This is what theologians and anthropologists have in common: an experience of wonder, one can even say that we share, about being human. You may say, theologians study God. That is what the word means, after all. But every human language has a word for God. So theology starts with the study of humans, because there is no other path to the divine, if there is one at all. Physicists, biologists, neuroscientists all start their careers with an experience of wonder. But the wonder theologians and anthropologists share is a feeling about human beings, that there is something extraordinary about our species. What inspires such feeling in part is what the Canadian economist, philosopher, and theologian Bernard Lonergan called the eros of the human spirit. He defined it in two directions. It is a single thrust, the eros of the human spirit. To know the good, it must know the real. To know the real, it must know the true. To know the true, it must know the intelligible. To know the intelligible, it must know the data. Later in life, he reversed the direction. The eros of the human spirit is a tidal movement that begins before consciousness, unfolds through sensitivity, intelligence, rational reflection, responsible deliberation, only to find its rest beyond all of these. Let's try an example. Imagine an astronomer begins to review the photographic plates her telescope took during a viewing session. Something catches her attention, and she focuses on it. Let's say there is apparent motion by a stellar object between two plates. After that initial focus, she gets an insight, an aha moment. She will then begin to formulate questions and consider a hypothesis. Then she will try to find ways to prove it, true or false. Finally, our astronomer will begin to think about what to do if indeed she has probably discovered something real. To get back to that focusing, that which caught her eye, it is not entirely autonomous by any means. She has much experience and has been well trained. But she's not necessarily conscious of this focusing at the time. Yet she will be able to relate later what attracted her attention and how she proceeded to question the data. A conscious act elicited another, that elicited a third and a fourth. Each moment is an exercise of sensitivity and intelligence, further rational reflection, and finally responsible deliberation. I submit to you that anthropologists follow the same basic process as our imaginary astronomer. This is not only the scientific, in fact, it is the description of what unfolds whenever a human wants to know. Unless one is differently abled, so to speak, we all have some experience of seeing or hearing, touching, smelling, or tasting, imagining or perceiving, feeling or moving. Or to put it another way, no one ever admits that they've never experienced intellectual curiosity, of inquiring, of striving and coming to understand, and of expressing what they've grasped by understanding. Who starts an article by warning readers that the author has never experienced anything like critical reflection, never wondered about the truth or falsity of a statement, has never judged anything strictly according to the available evidence, and is in fact totally unaware of any such thing? How many are those, finally, who put in their books a disclaimer that they have no notion of what might be meant by responsibility, that never in their lives did they ever act responsibly, least of all in writing the books they're offering to the public? Now, I did start out by saying I would try to give some clarity about terms including faith, belief, hypothesis, and knowledge. I'm getting there. Faith and belief are essential aspects of human cognition. But to reiterate, we first arrive at knowledge by paying attention, by asking all the relevant questions, by answering them as best as we can, and assuming the consequences of what we've learned. That is to say, when we've discovered something that we can say is quite probably true, we've added to the store of our knowledge. And it may be that we've also increased the store of humanity's knowledge. Probably. There is that funny word, probably. We all know that we humans have difficulty with probability. I have been reading a book on learning poker, The Biggest Bluff by Maria Konnikova. I have no interest in playing myself. I spent 3 of my young years financing my studies in Paris, working in a gambling joint. I saw what gambling addiction can do to a person. Good training for a future priest, by the way. I wanted to know if knowledge of probability is important in poker, which is, as the great mathematician John Neumann said, the most human of games of chance. Roulette, I know very well, and it is strictly chance. Put your money on a number, and your odds of winning are 35 to 1, or 2.86%. Poker requires psychology as well. That is why one can make a living as a professional poker player. Konnikova, a journalist, wanted to learn how to play at championship level in a year. It's a fun read, but the most important point is the only way to beat the odds, so to speak, is to play what you believe the other players believe the odds are. Because the fact is, the probabilities of poker, like all games of chance, are set in stone. It is what we believe, however, that makes it interesting. As Konnikova says, we need to train ourselves to see the world in a probabilistic light. And even then, we often ignore the numbers in favor of our own experience. Why? Belief. We're driven by eros, not Sophia. Need, not wisdom. Belief is what we conceive to be true. It is a concept, a formed idea, and each of us has spent a lifetime collecting them. A few are certainly true. Many are probably true, and many are false. Because we began forming our beliefs from our cribs, we're not aware of all of them. But one thing is for sure, we need them in order to function at all. We've been imagining an astronomer bending over her photographs of the night sky. Yet seeing the contrast between 2 plates awakens her focus. Hello, what's this? Her imagination is provoked. The brain sets up an anticipation between 2 neuronal streams, from the senses to the higher organs, and also in reverse. Our brains are always trying to predict what we will experience. In this particular instance, the dissonance that often occurs between what we expect and what we actually get invokes curiosity. Most of these processes lie in what has been termed the adaptive unconscious. While it does rely on the adaptive unconscious initially, the ability to imagine is the first step beyond the psychic consciousness of the animal toward the consciousness of that so-called rational animal that we are supposed to be. Imagination awakens when the eros to know is stimulated and belief informs it. All too often we settle on what we believe without reflection. As Konnikova says, we ignore the numbers in favor of our own experience. Being a good astronomer or anthropologist or theologian means we are constantly aware that our imaginings are not knowledge. This depends on always recalling that our beliefs are only at best probable, and therefore we are willing to put them to the test when we sense the need. So my talk joins Dr. Menachem Fish's talk. A belief critically entertained is a hypothesis. It needs testing. Of course, there are reasons why we might not. Entertaining a hypothesis can get you into trouble, especially if you live and work in, say, North Korea, or your hypothesis goes against conventional wisdom, and proving it will bring down upon you the wrath of the authorities who control your livelihood. But probably this only happens to theologians. Such proof is also hard work. So if you have a big ego and believe you can do no wrong, you bypass the testing and claim it as a fact. And again, only theologians do that sort of thing, of course, probably. Putting a hypothesis to the test is judging it to be true, false, or undetermined. Truth is only reached when all possible questions about the hypothesis have been raised and correctly answered. And what is true is always concrete because it is real. What is false is discarded because it is not real. And if there can be no judgment either way, then you need to go back to the proverbial drawing board. In all cases, we can only assert that a hypothesis is probably true. And the best trained minds will try to assign it a numerical probability, though probably not 2.86%. Most of what we think we know is what we believe. John Henry Newman remarked that he knew what Great Britain looks like because he believed the map makers. He trusted their work, which is to say he had faith in it. Faith is nothing more than the confidence we place in a belief. The marker of faith is not only confidence, but doubt. Dr. Fish again. In other words, the grounds for our confidence can always be revisited for questioning. If we're certain about something, we no longer have faith in it, because certainty comes only when there are no more questions, or we think there are no more questions. In this sense, all of you and me too are people who live by faith, the confidence we place in our beliefs. We have few things in life that are absolutely certain. Death and taxes, as they say, and maybe a few others. All too often, people today want to categorize humans as having faith or no, religious or not religious. But being religious does not require a special form of faith. The English theologian Austin Ferrer said this: "The mysteries of faith must fit into one universe of sense with our natural knowledge of human personality, of history, of the form of nature, of the first principles of being. If they did not, they would not continue to be believed. The judgment upon which faith is based is an estimation like that used in other fields. Faith leaps beyond it, but that happens too in common life. Our faith in the goodwill of a friend goes beyond and leaves behind any weighing of the evidence for it and becomes a rooted axiom for living. In the case of a friend, such an axiom may be rooted, but not ineradicable. Our friend may disappoint us. In my case and yours, faith leaps beyond in instilling confidence in our beliefs. At heart, it is a feeling. Belief is conceptual, but sustained with that confidence. In certain circumstances, a belief can become a hypothesis, and if tested, may then become knowledge. Finally, that knowledge, which is held by an individual only, is not really knowledge. It can never be private, but must be shared in order to be indirectly applied over and over. Criticism. I want to conclude by saying why I think offering these particular definitions of terms that are usually batted around loosely can be helpful on my own field. First, I posit that when someone feels the desire to know something, that is the beginning of what is a common human experience, this eros of a human spirit. Faith and belief form essential aspects of our coming to know. As such, they are also reasons why we miss the mark, along with inattention, stupidity, irrationality, and irresponsibility. In theology, mistaking belief for certainty leads to fundamentalism, which is the root of religious violence because it is exclusionary. We're right, you're wrong. In science, mistaking belief for certainty leads to scientism, the analogous of religious fundamentalism. We each need to recognize the probabilistic nature of our own faith, beliefs, and knowledge. Embracing the need for doubt to purify and strengthen faith is essential to clear thinking and the knowledge of, and the accumulation of knowledge in any field. But maybe I should take up poker after all. Thank you for listening.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed that very much. Okay, our second speaker in this session then is known to us, I think, many of us, is Ben Barber, who is a graduate, as I have good reason to know, of the PhD program at the University of Ottawa. And he teaches now in the United International College in China. He's been a frequent contributor of talks at GA conferences and articles to Anthropologics, most recently at the 2019 GA conference in New York City and in the fall issue of that year of Anthropologics. He has a chapter entitled Post-Pandemic Literature, Force and Moral Obligation to the Other in Boccaccio's Decameron and Camus' The Plague. And that's coming out in a forthcoming book called COVID-19, Pandemic Crisis Responses in the Changing World. It's from Springer Publication. This chapter draws on the work of Emmanuel Levinas and Simone Weil. His current interests include Levinas and Weil, and most recently Emil Cioran, as well as the novels and essays of Marilyn Robinson. I may not be pronouncing that name correctly. Anyway, Ben's talk today is Signifying Nothing, Emil Cioran's Apophatic Failure to Exist.
Thanks, Ian. So I just realized that many people probably don't have any idea who Cioran, he's Romanian, name's pronounced Cioran, is. He was born in 1911 in Romania and moved over the course of the war.
Ben, can I break in for just a sec? Are you able to increase your volume at all?
How's that?
That's
Is
much
that
better. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Cioran, as I was saying, he's Romanian, and he moved over the course of the war to Paris to get away from Romania because he felt his countrymen were kind of backward, and joined the intellectual circles that were going on in Paris sort of near the end of the war. So he's a contemporary of Sartre. He was a friend of Beckett's. And he started a PhD there, but didn't finish it, and instead began to write and won some pretty prestigious literary awards. But he kind of kept himself in obscurity through most of his career. In part, his biographer speculates, and I think knows, because he was sort of ashamed of an enthusiasm for fascism and Hitlerism in his past, which he didn't talk very much about. He spent some time in Germany. So a lot of his work can be read as a sort of an attempt to correct his errors, if you want. Let me begin. As we know, GA holds that the mimetic repetition of the aborted gesture of appropriation or sign moved the first humans to view the object they pointed towards as sacred. As the ritual of object designation transformed into religions, which then began an ongoing process of reform, the scenically arrayed worshippers ceased to insist on making a particular object the focus of their sacralizing attention. Having a scene with a center was enough. Nevertheless, this center remained the ostensible locus of the deity who, when translated into the terms of metaphysics, was understood as truth or being. Apophatic or negative theology and its associated mysticism encourages Christian contemplatives to give up any word or concept they have for God. Thus, similar to GA, apophatic theology views the center of the sacred scene as, in its most basic form, empty. Emil Cioran, who is this paper's focus, was a careful student of the practices of Christian mysticism, including those of the apophatic mystics, John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila. In his collection of essays, The Temptation to Exist, he's a philosophical stylist more than he is a philosopher, states that if we closely examine our capacity for representation, i.e. thought or philosophy, we'll find it impossible to make incontrovertibly true statements. Because of this, he claims, we cannot understand ourselves to exist, as for Cioran, existence is defined as thinking. Thought and existence are neither brute facts nor logical givens, but paradoxical, unstable situations. Straining towards a truthful statement, Cioran tries, but repeatedly fails to achieve existence. For him, there is only the void. Occasionally, by thinking against his every assumption, he feels himself come close to existence, but ultimately returns to what he terms a deficit of being. Cioran's stylization of his failure resembles the practices of the mystics. Just as they wrote of their many failures to attain the beatific vision, Cioran reiterates the enduring absence of the central object of the originary scene. In so doing, I will argue, he foregrounds the scenicity of the human as manifest in our iterative efforts to recover an origin, truth, or being, and being. Building on Christian teachings, I'll just talk a little bit about negative theology. Building on Christian teachings about the incomprehensibility of God, Pseudo-Dionysius championed apophatic theology, writing in 500 CE under his pseudonym Dionysius the Areopagite, which alludes to Paul's reference to the unknown God in Acts 17:34. Pseudo-Dionysius outlined his program for attaining union with God in a book called Mystical Theology. His mystical practice requires all positive naming of God, important as it is, to yield to negative naming in order for the soul to attain union with God, who lies beyond all affirmation and negation. In chapter 1 of Mystical Theology, Dionysius advises his disciple to leave behind everything perceived and understood, and with your understanding laid aside, to strive upward as much as you can toward union with him who is beyond all being and knowledge. There is a link, as I said, I think, to GA's scenic center and this sort of unthinking of the unconceivable God. And I find it in the originary thinking's discussion of the idea of God. So Gans asserts that the origin of the idea of God must be scenic because God appears to human beings as a center of attention consciously distinct from themselves. And then GA hypothesizes that the sign designates the originary scene center and that the center of the scene is itself the locus of divinity. And I'll just quote, this is a longer quote from Originary Thinking. God is the subsisting center of the scene of representation on which specific ideas appear. As this center, God is no particular object of attention, but the permanent object of attention as such. However, it may appear to reveal itself in a particular physical being. This revelation can only be understood as God's appearance rather than his subsistence in the being in question. For the idea of God is the idea of what subsists in the physical being's absence. Proposing that the scene of representation produces the subsistence of the deity as manifest in a space devoid of any particular being or idea, Gans goes on to assert the sign can only designate what occupies the center of the scene, and the being of this center, the center as being, is what we call God. If the center of the scene is vacant, while the designation of the divine center continues, the deity's scenic mode of subsisting manifests in the signs that point towards God's subsistence beyond discrete objects, beings, ideas, and signs themselves. It is the structure of the scene of attention that manifests the deity as absence, since scenicity itself, in direction of attention towards a vacant center, is enough to orient the representing subject toward the divine absence. In this sense, GA articulates a negative theology that does not preclude the adoption of positive or cataphatic theological traditions, but rather illustrates those traditions' contingency upon the scenicity that presents divinity subsisting as a vacant center of attention. Leading up to articulating this scenic anthropology of the idea of God, Gans addresses the rise of metaphysics after theology and finds that these efforts lack any anthropology adequate to account for the persistence of the idea of God. I think this was in the keynote. Gans asserts that the metaphysics had tried an explanation of the notion of the divine as Weltgeist and Hegel and being and Heidegger. He points out more recently, Derrida has exposed the failure of metaphysics by highlighting the instability of language through the concept of différance. Gans then states that the successive metaphysics that sought a new synthesis for the idea of God were abandoned in favor of positive sciences that asserts that those intellectuals who still entertain an idea of God are ultimately forced to take on an anthropological theology. Gans' solution is the originary hypothesis, wherein God and the human emerge from the originary scene simultaneously. In her 1968 introduction to Cioran's collection of essays, The Temptation to Exist, Susan Sontag outlines a similar account of the philosophy's progress and ultimate failure to that traced by Gans. She describes how the decline of metaphysics is followed by the rise of various positive or descriptive sciences of man, which include anthropology, sociology, and linguistics. She then goes on to observe that during the period that these social sciences were gaining ascendance over metaphysics, an alternative to the new descriptive and positive sciences emerged. This alternative was a, quote, new kind of philosophizing, which was personal, even autobiographical, aphoristic, lyrical, and anti-systematic. She named its foremost exemplars as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Wittgenstein, before defining the philosophy as, quote, philosophizing the awareness that the traditional forms of philosophical discourse have been broken. What remains as leading possibilities are mutilated in complete discourse. The aphorism, the note, the jotting, or discourse has resisted metamorphosis into other forms: the parable, the poem, the philosophical tale, the critical exegesis. Sontag states that Emil Cioran is the most distinguished figure in this tradition writing today. Though, that's 1968, obviously. Though Cioran pursues this route of thinking in the form of essays, his essays have an aphoristic quality that Sontag notes bears witness to the most intimate impasse of the speculative mind, moving outward only to be checked and broken off by the complexity of its own stance. Commenting on one of Cioran's essays titled Dealing with the Mystics, Sontag observes how closely Cioran's project resembles that of Dionysius the Areopagite, and remarks that he clearly admires the audacious scale of the mystics project, which his essays strive to attain by asserting the impossibility of a God of the beyond. This is true, but in the essay, the title essay of Temptation to Exist, Cioran goes further than denying the possibility of a deity or coherent metaphysics when he gives an autobiographical account of how, as a young scholar, he apprenticed himself, I'm quoting, to every force that invalidated his existence. In his account of the process, Cioran reflects on the social, what GA would identify as the periphery of the human scene, as a wasteland of cadavers. This spectacle propelled him to the verge of what he refers to as the void. Ceasing to live in terms of a self, Cioran writes, I gave death enough rope for my own enslavement. In other words, I no longer belonged to myself. My terrors, even my name, were born by death. And by substituting itself for my own eyes, death revealed to me in all things the marks of its sovereignty. Even his conception of himself, as it is based in the social, his name, is merely an occasion for his own negation and the negation of those around him. Everywhere, he states, I stumbled against future victims of the noose, against their imminent shadows. In this period of his life, Cioran takes the center of the human scene to be as empty as what lies beyond the outer edge of its periphery. The void was my Eucharist, he writes, using a metaphor drawn from the symbolism of the sacred. Everything within me, anything exterior to me, was transubstantiated into a ghost. Irresponsible at the antipodes of consciousness, I ended up by delivering myself to the anonymity of the elements. He goes on, unable to see in death the positive expression of the void, the agent that awakens the creature from itself. The summons resounding in the ubiquity of drowsiness, I knew nothingness by heart, and I accepted my knowledge. He persists in this habit of unknowing, he says, until, having reluctantly attempted to seek the comfort of the illusion that something exists, he realized that he could not claim to know any truth, but sought to become the conquistador of the continent of lies, which is to say, the land of those who believe that they exist. At this point, he recognized that he had only two options, to be duped or die, that is, to accept the idea of existence or commit suicide. After the banality of the abyss, he exclaims, what miracles in being! Existence is the unheard of, what cannot happen, a state of exception, and nothing can engage it save our desire to accede to it, to force an entrance, to take it by assault. To exist is a habit I do not despair of acquiring. What G.A. would term scenicity appears in the preceding image of Cioran storming a citadel, a sacred center encircled by a besieging horde. However, this fortress of being is for Cioran as unattainable as it is an uninhabitable void. It exists only to the extent that the collective desire attempt yet fail to attain it. It is just such a siege of the void that Cioran sees in the mystics' efforts to achieve unity with the divine. In an essay titled Dealing with the Mystics, Cioran writes, it is a mistake to suppose that mysticism derives from a softening of the instincts, from a compromise of vitality. A John of the Cross crowned an age of great enterprises and was necessarily a contemporary of the conquest. Cioran goes on to argue that the mystics' idolatry of the will's abeyance, of gentleness and passivity, secured them against a scarcely bearable tension, against that superabundant hysteria which is responsible for their intolerance, their proselytism, their power over this world and the next. Thus, far from being defectives, they fought for their faith, attacked God head-on, appropriated heaven for themselves. Echoing his characterization of his youthful conquest of the continent of lies, he writes that to understand the mystics, one must imagine a Hernando Cortez in the middle of an invisible geography. Seeking to explore this nothingness, mystics are, Cioran asserts, avid for every kind of wound, hypnotized by the unwanted they have undertaken, the conquest of the only fiction worth the trouble. God owes them everything, his glory, his mystery, his eternity. They lend existence to the inconceivable, violate nothing in order to animate it. Having highlighted the absurdity of their effort to animate nothingness, Cioran wryly raises the mystics' project above that of philosophers. Quote, contrary to that abstract false void of the philosophers, the mystics' nothingness glistens with plenitude, delight out of this world, discharge of duration, a luminous annihilation beyond the limits of thought. From these ornate descriptions of mystical writing, it is evident, as already noted, that Cioran both derides and enviously admires the mystics' project. However, through the practice of ever refining his style in denying the possibility of truth and being, he emulates them by striving towards the limits of thought. Far from being a soul seeking union with the deity, Cioran understands himself as a mind engaged in a certain type of difficult thinking, a mind which, if it ever finally reached the limits of thought brought about by self-negation, would be able to recover itself as an existent human being. For Cioran, Sontag observes, thought and existence are neither brute facts nor logical givens. I quoted this before, but unstable situations, right? Making an apt comparison to Heinrich von Kleist's treatment of self-consciousness in On the Marionette Theater, Sontag explains her understanding of Cioran's project as an attempt to rediscover genuine thought by refusing to ever accept any theory or conceptual mode. Quote, his thesis is that however much we may long to repair the disorders in the natural harmony of man created by consciousness, this is not to be accomplished by a surrender of consciousness. There is no return, no going back to innocence. We have no choice but to go to the end of thought, and there perhaps on the other side, in total self-consciousness to recover grace and innocence. Thus, Cioran appropriates the Apophatic tradition's technique of abnegation of conceptions of God as a means to reach him, and, refusing the existence of a deity or anything else, pushes its antithetical logic further. First, he thinks himself out of existence in order to place existence beyond reach and thereby make it into a longed-for impossibility, only to turn on his heel and ineffectually strive to attain it. At the end of the temptation to exist, he enjoins his reader to take up his radical practice. Quote, we must learn to think against our doubts and against our certitudes, against our omniscient humors. We must above all, by creating for ourselves another death, one that will be incompatible with our carrion carcasses consent to the undemonstrable, to the idea that something exists. Nothingness may well have been more convenient. How difficult it is to dissolve oneself in being. Embracing its own nothingness, Cioran's mind longs to turn its gaze back on itself and thereby realize its own non-existence in order to reify itself as an existent entity. However, having outlined his project, his final expostulation is one of failure. Cioran, by publishing his repeated failures, reiterates the enduring absence at the heart of consciousness, an interior scene with an invisible periphery and void at its center. In his adaptation of the apophatic technique, he creates a scene similar to the one posited by GA as a scene of representation. Like GA, Cioran's thought begins by avowing his resentment of the other and his impulse to continue to represent his failed efforts to attain the being others espouse but unwittingly fail to attain. In his attacks on the mystic's hubris and his own efforts to outstrip them, Cioran both comprehends and manifests the mimetic rivalry that compels him to refine such radical negations. He imitates the desires of the periphery towards the center, not by emitting a sign that imitates their affirmation of the central object's desirability, but by indexing the empty space gaping in the abyssal center. In his interior scene, he identifies an empty space beyond the scene's outer edge as well, a space created by his symmetrical opposition to the central object-oriented other. Thus, in engaging the intellectual world through his writing, Cioran uses language, but deploys it in order to make language work against itself. Having vehemently articulated the vacuity of the center, Cioran turns his back on it and moves as far away from it as possible, thereby establishing an inverted symmetry with his fellow sign emitters. In his 1949 book, A Short History of Decay, Cioran provides a vivid image of the scenicity of language and culture through the attempt to negate it. In a passage titled Promenade Around the Circumference, he writes, "Within the circle which encloses human beings in a community of interests and hopes, the mind opposed to mirages clears a path from the center toward the periphery. It can no longer hear at close range the hum of humanity. It wants to consider from as far away as possible the accursed symmetry which links men together. The mirages rejected by the mind, Cioran describes, correspond to the fabrications of language, hypotheses, systems, certainties, and fantasized futures, all of which consist of signs collectively fastened to desired objects, be they physical or imaginary. The disenchanted mind," he continues, "withdraws to the extreme margin and follows the rim of the circle, which he cannot cross so long as he is subject to the body. While on life's circumference, the soul promenades, meeting only itself over and over again, itself and its impotence to answer the call of the void. At this extreme distance from the symmetry of signs and the form of the center, the mind encounters itself at the limit of the scene of language. From this vantage, it can apprehend the scene's center and perceive, as Gans writes, that the clearing that is at the center is no particular object of attention, but the permanent object of attention as such. Thus, a mind perceives that within the interior scene of the sign user, its own representation of the center is effectively equivalent to its representation of the outer darkness beyond the general human scene, and thereby representation as an iteration of futile gestures." I'm about to conclude. Thanks for your patience. In his fragmentary, self-confounding aphorisms and essays, Cioran claims to inhabit the absence that the apophatic mystics struggle to conquer through their own contemplative negations. By taking these mystics as models that he ultimately outstrips, he illuminates the void that is the center of the originary scene, since any object, being, or concept could be cast into this blank space. One which, in its vacuous banality, forces the onlooker to return his gaze to the language-animated sociality of the periphery. I guess this is the oscillation we were talking about earlier, perhaps. That hum of humanity constructed out of the symmetry which links men together. Cioran sees in this symmetry, wherein ideas proliferate through emulation, a need for the individual to refuse all doubt, all certainty, and all emotion in order to attempt the impossible, to definitively crystallize an ultimate truth that would ground one's being. Only this gesture could conquer the continent of lies, which our mimetic symmetries ceaselessly engender. Pursuing this lofty ambition, Cioran's anthropoetics are the disjointed rages and resignations of his mind's iterative and abortive struggle to subsist beyond intellectual life's stalemates and aporias, which persist in others' thought and within his own. Ultimately, in its highly wrought contradictions and impasses, Cioran's stylization of his struggle affords readers a unique prospect of the empty center of humanities and the individual's originary scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two great papers that obviously got some possible synergies, it would seem to me. Let's open things up now for questions to either of our speakers. Maybe I could get started then, unless I don't see anything. Yeah, I mean, as I say, it seems to me the two papers have got lots of things in common, or they could be made to talk to each other and so forth. When Ben was describing Cioran's project here, the phrase that I always kind of liked from, I think it's from Girard, came back to me about the emptier than thou spiritual dandyism. And obviously that's a little unfair perhaps to someone I think, Ben, you're taking quite seriously. But at the same time, I mean, you reference that mimetic element in this mediated struggle and so forth. And I go back to Bishop Whalon's talk also, when describing fundamentalism as this, what you might do, to adapt that phrase, maybe it's fuller than thou spiritual dandyism, that indicated that we know, better. I mean, doubt clearly is more in the territory that in between the two of them, perhaps we could say. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether either of you would want to speak to each other's talks about these relative projects and put them maybe in the context of mimetic struggle, of desire, basically, desire to be something in distinction of or in relation to other people and their desires. Is that possible?
Sure. Yeah. I guess I appreciated Pierre's focus on that idea of something being probably true, which seems to me to be a little more optimistic than what Cioran's doing in terms of sort of being persistent. The one thing I've been sort of reading with him and struggling with him a little bit, I don't fully understand about his thinking is that what does it mean to negate everything in order to find a truth? When do you ever get to that point? It seems like he's sort of throwing himself down an abyss, which, as you say, Ian, is it's a sort of very sort of romantic thing to do, to sort of flee the center, right? And I mean, he's in that tradition, so that makes sense. But yeah, it seems kind of like Pierre is speaking from the light, whereas Cioran's definitely speaking from the darkness, So, but saying similar things.
I think exactly that there's we can only get as most probably true, and that's not very often. Mm-hmm. And what's the rest? Our delusions, our illusions, the falsehoods that make us feel good. I mentioned working in a gambling joint, and it's a grand palace of delusion that somehow something called luck is going to change and make you rich. But it's really all about just the thrill of risking something. It's a terrible addiction because it's only in here. It's not like in here. You can cure that yourself with that, but gambling is a terrible thing. Because you're always dancing on the edge of the abyss. And this is what I was thinking about when you were describing this thinker that I only know the name. I've never read anything by him. But it's like he's running up to the cliff edge to see if someone's going to stop him. And, he looks down and he said, oh, wait a minute. No one's here to stop me. Well, it's two sides of the same coin in some respect. The other thing is the urge to know, the eros of the human spirit, which is a phrase I really like, isn't something that we do a whole lot of. It's when we're intrigued by something, when we suddenly want to know what it is, or why it is, or how it is. And most of the rest of the time, we're feeding the dog and trying to make $1 and or €1 in my case, and so I think there's room for both perspectives. Although his is it's sort of a romantic death wish, and I think it's pushed to the edge, not only of the periphery but beyond.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I'm kind of curious. I felt like I was, in terms of GA, if, and this is a question for Eric, how do you feel like I got the idea of the center? You were talking about the stage earlier, and I wonder if is it possible to characterize the center as empty as I think Cioran imagines it, and I kind of assert it as well.
Well, I think if you start out by assuming that people aren't trying to reconstruct the origin of the human, but they're dealing with the world as they find it, and then the fact that we are naturally scenic beings, that we see things in terms of a center, then you have this sense of a horrible disillusion when you find the center is empty and so on. This is so much a part of romanticism and the kind of very negative romanticism that Cioran represents. In other words, you can't make this into a kind of theory of the origin of the human, but I don't think that that's the point of this sort of attitude. It's more coming to the world and in this existential way and discovering its emptiness, and discovering the great sense of disappointment, disillusion, which is so typical of Cioran and of many writers of that era. After all, there are plenty of reasons to be disillusioned. So I think, in other words, the GA element, if I can say that, is precisely the fact that we are scenic and we expect there to be something useful on the scene. Now, if Cioran, for instance, met a Buddhist, he might have discovered that the emptiness is precisely what he wanted. That wasting your time looking at things on the scene as though this is more important than that is an illusion. That really what you want is just the scene itself. In other words, if you like, pure humanity or God. But obviously, that's not a typical Judeo-Christian reaction.
If I can say, in the Hebrew scriptures, the description of the Ark of the Covenant, you have the two cherubim on each side. And so where is Adonai? In the center space, which is to our eyes.
Sorry, that last part. Just are you talking about the Shekinah glory in the middle?
Yes.
Is that? Yeah.
That's exactly right. It's there, but you don't see it. Is it really there?
Is it really there?
That's what Cioran and a lot of people like him are saying. Well, there's nothing there. Why are you even looking at it? This stupid box, or altar, or cross, or Vishnu, or whatever you're looking at. Nothing really there.
Il n'y a rien.
Were you going to continue, or are there other comments, questions for our speakers? Marina.
Yes, a question for Father Whalon. I find it difficult to wrap my mind around the idea of the probabilistic nature of faith, because to me, these are opposite things. You know, the probabilistic is something, it's the outside perspective. You know, if I'm on a plane and the plane is crashing, you know, what does it matter to me that it was like 99.99% safe? And, you know, even thinking of Pascal's wager, for example, isn't the whole idea behind the wager is that, you know, this is for a person who is doubting. So here's the rationale. So maybe I don't understand them, or you went over like what your understanding of faith is, but yeah, I find it confusing. Thank you.
Yes, call me Pierre, by the way.
Okay.
That's what I call myself. So, of course, Pascal's wager, as you say, is intended for someone who has trouble believing, but it still ends up a wager. It's still, in essence, a bet. And you know, Pascal was very influential in early game theory. So in that sense, it's still a bet. But to use your example of being in a plane that is in trouble and has a 99% chance of crashing, if I understood you to say that,
sorry, I meant that if you fly on a plane, it's supposed to be very safe. So you're saying, I will buy a ticket because it's very safe. But when it's crashing, like, what does it matter that it was safe? Like, you're either here or you're there. The probabilities don't really exist, you know, as your internal perspective. That's what I meant.
Exactly. That's which is why we need to remember that our internal perspectives need to be questioned. And that goes back to what Dr. Fish was saying. And we can't really do it ourselves. So, but on the other hand, you know, if I have no doubt, I have no faith. Faith is a confidence, it's a trust. And if I don't have any, because I'm certain, you know, I don't have faith that I'm going to die. I'm certain that I'm going to die. It's just, the odds of my dying are precisely 0, 100 to 0. I mean, this is not something I doubt. When I stand up in front of a crowd of people and preach to them about Jesus, I always try to remember that I too need to be doubting from time to time what I say. And the whole thing of the dark night of the soul is the required purification of doubt. If you don't have any doubt, you don't have any faith. Which is why if you end up as a person of faith going through a doubting moment, it's not a bad thing. It doesn't feel good necessarily. It's part of and this kind of faith is nothing more than the faith that we place in buying a ticket and flying on Scandinavian Airlines. It's all, you know, yes, it's a very safe form of travel, and then planes also do fall out of the sky. But we're still flying on faith as well. Thank you for that question. I hope I helped.
Other questions or thoughts on these two excellent papers? Richard.
Marina's question prompted me to think of, maybe you've read this book, Pierre, Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yes, one of my favorite books.
Well, I mean, I read it a long time ago, so I don't remember the details, but essentially the two kinds of thought systems we use, so the internal system would be thinking fast, and then the probability would be thinking slow. Maybe that maps onto his distinction, roughly speaking. I'm probably misremembering it, but it seems to me that this idea of the internal, it's not the internal scene, but the being in the scene itself and experiencing it, you have this flight or fight response. But it's precisely the space to, defer that emotional reaction that that book is into discussing. I mean, he gives masses of examples, and he talks about how he himself has caught himself out, marking student essays or exam papers. He thinks that he's being objective, but then he notices that he's got these cognitive biases, and I guess this references Fisher's talk too. When he thinks of himself thinking this process, then he realizes he's falling into his own trap. But I'm glad to hear it from the books.
That's what you can do. That's what the human being can do that the monkey can't. He catches himself falling into his own trap. That ability to transcend your own thinking process and turn around and look at it is the thing that we can do. And that's thanks, and that's where what I love so much about the originary scene heuristic is that it enables you to put that in at least some form of history, of an imagined history, but it explains also the kind of automatic responses that we have as well, because we're still just apes too.
Yeah, I should also thank you for calling us anthropologists.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't know. It says Generative Anthropology Summer Conference. I figured I was talking to anthropologists. And the only thing I know about anthropology is what I learned from Eric and a few other people. But
couldn't have a better start.
Just be careful if you go into an anthropology department in a university. That's all I'll say.
Oh, that I understand. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I think Magdalena's in the anthropology department, isn't she?
Well, the Polish are obviously on the right track. That's all I can say.
Well, I just want to compliment Ben on this paper too, because I thought that was, I absolutely want to read Emil Cioran now.
Actually, I have a question for Ben, just a very sort of personal question, if I may. When did you start reading Cioran? Was it before or after you'd read Gans?
It was after, yeah. I only encountered him like last year for the first time. But it's strange that the images that he uses, he's always talking about centers and peripheries. And even in his biography, his biographer does too, because she sets up this dichotomy between Paris as the intellectual center of Europe and him feeling like as a Romanian, he's at the periphery. He's out, with the tribes, and he wants to get to the center. And then he masters French and he learns to write in French and spends all this time refining his style, reworking the same ideas over and over again. So I think, yeah, even his biography, but not really finding anything, right? I mean, he lived in, even though he got these awards, he kept a very low profile. He didn't want any of it. And I mean, to read his stuff, he's miserable, which is comforting sometimes, to read a miserable person.
Absolutely.
So there was no scandal around his Nazi sympathies, like there was, for example, around Paul de Man, because he wasn't a celebrity, I guess, or was there?
That's right. That's right. No, yeah. That's part of the reason he didn't get taken down very hard. I mean, now that he's passed on and he sort of is having a kind of resurgence, I think there's been some books that come out that are critical. But his biographer, she takes issue with that because she knew him personally, and she really does characterize all of his work as an attempt to escape that thinking. But he got caught up in nationalist fascism. as a young
Escape.
guy.
Escape would it be too strong? I mean, I haven't read him, so I don't know.
Yeah.
Escape or atone? I mean, what how much?
Yeah, he could be either of those. I mean, he didn't. I think he knew that if he got too famous, that he'd be taken down publicly. So he didn't accept the awards. He only accepted one award. The French liked him a lot, but I don't know. Atone might be a better term.
Okay, well, I think we kind of run through the time and a little past officially for the session. So maybe we could formally once more thank both of our speakers. It was really an excellent session, and I enjoyed it very much. Roman has told us that we can hang around for a bit if anybody wants to. Of course, you're not obliged to. I know some of us are in difficult time zones and others. What time is it for you, Ben, right at the moment? It must be...
It's almost 4 a.m.
4 a.m.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
there you go. We appreciate.
Might as well just stay up, right?
Exactly.
I got to get to bed. I have a meeting on campus tomorrow. So.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, again, thanks for coming.
Good to see you.
It was great to see you, and hopefully some more. And as I say, anyone else who would like to hang in for a little bit, I guess we can do that. I have to step out of the room for just a couple minutes, but I presume that the link will just remain here for a bit, and it's great to see everybody.
Thank you, Ian, for moderating.
My pleasure. Thanks,
you. Everybody. Good night.
Yeah.
I'm going to go. My wife is waiting dinner for me. The great joys of being an Anglican bishop is you get to be married if you want to.
Oh, bon appétit.
Merci. Bonne nuit à tous.
Bonne nuit.
Merci.